This is a story of a castle. For over 550 years, it has stood on the shores of the Forth, close to Orchard Head Woods, popularly called the Bluebell Woods. In its heyday, it would have been an important and well-known centre of administration in West Fife. In its midlife period, when it was unoccupied, it would have become no more than a landmark and a useful source of quarried stone, which could be recycled. During most of the 20th century, although it was cared for, it had largely become forgotten. So I'm going to begin by looking at this most recent period, and we start with a photograph taken in the early 1900s by local photographer James Norval. It shows the castle standing on its rocky outcrop in the waters of the Forth. It was completely surrounded by water at certain high tides. The latest chapter in the castle's history began in 1909, when work started on the construction of a Royal Naval dockyard. The castle's tranquil existence was soon shattered by the noise of steam locomotives, drilling, explosions and piling. The main means of bringing in materials was by rail, with the main railway line passing close to the castle, presumably making use of the good foundations provided by the rock on which the castle stood. A large shed was erected close to the front of the castle, and the courtyard of the castle was used as a storage area. An article in the Scotsman newspaper in May 1916 referred to Rosyth Castle as having been robbed of its dignity, having been converted into a store for oily waste. At some stage, thick concrete floors were laid on the ground and first floors of the castle. In the early days, the main dockyard works were further west, where they were building the graving docks and power plant and so on. But eventually the land round the castle was reclaimed, and it was soon surrounded by buildings and roads. This is an interesting aerial view of the area taken in 1919. The orange arrow points to the castle. This more recent view was taken in 1978 from the security fence on the edge of Orchard Head Woods. This helps to explain the reason for the castle being forgotten. The castle was an ancient monument under the care of the Ministry of Public Buildings and Works, and in theory it was possible to arrange a visit to it, but this required a certain amount of red tape. This view through the security fence was as close as you could get to the castle. Standing as it did within the confines of the dockyard, many Rosyth folk were not aware of its existence, even some who worked in the dockyard. It is only with the departure of the Navy in the late 1990s and the sale of the land on the eastern side of the dockyard that the castle became accessible to the public once again. With the cooperation of the owners, the Scarborough Muir Group, our association has tried to publicise the existence of the castle through a major week-long event we held there in 2008, and for a number of years by opening up the castle for the annual Doors Open Day event held in September. I'm now going to go back in time and explore the history of the castle. So first, let us look at the early years of Rosyth. The name Rosyth has been around for hundreds of years. The earliest reference is in a charter in 1162. There was a barony of Rosyth, there was Rosyth Castle, Rosyth Doocot, a Rosyth church on the outskirts of Lime Kilns, which dates back to the 12th century, although the present remains are from a later period, and Rosyth Farm. As is the case with old place names, there have been many different spellings of Rosyth over the years. As to its meaning, the first part, Ross, is generally accepted to mean promontory or headland, but the second part is much less clear. Suggestions have included landing place, arrows, and a seat or settlement. The latest and possibly most authoritative is in Simon Taylor's book on the place names of Fife. He suggests that the Ross refers to the headland of North Queensferry, with the Ithe or Ive as it appeared in earlier versions meaning of Fife, thus the headland of Fife. There is no significant headland or promontory in the area of Rosyth Farm and Castle, and perhaps it was the one at North Queensferry which gave Rosyth its name. This view of North Queensferry in an 1843 print, and this is taken from the opposite side of the Forth, shows the impressive headland with Inchgarvie Island lying in front of it. The barony of Rosyth seems to have existed as far back as the 13th century, but became fragmented under different ownerships. By the early part of the 15th century, most of the lands seem to have been brought together in the ownership of David Stewart. He was a favourite of the court of King James I and was one of a number of men knighted by the king at his coronation in 1425. He was granted a crown charter for the lands of Rosyth in 1428. The Stuarts of Rosyth lineage does not directly stem from the royal house of Stuart, but it does descend from a common ancestor, Alexander the Fourth High Steward of Scotland. So David Stewart is descended from the line of Alexander's second son, John, who after his marriage to an heiress was designated Sir John Stewart of Bonkill. I won't talk you through this family tree in detail, but it's interesting to see from the right-hand column that Sir David's ancestors were very much involved in Scotland's military struggles over the years. This is an illustration of the coat of arms of the Stuarts of Rosyth, which I obtained from the court of the Lord Lion. The blue and white squares in the centre is known as the fesse chequered, azure and argent, and apologies for the pronunciation, azure and argent being blue and white. And it appears in many of the coats of arms of the wider Stuart family. The symbols on the red edge of the shield are buckles. The general practice in heraldry at that time was that successive generations used the same coat of arms, although sometimes with minor variations. The arms for Sir David of 1489, grandson of the Sir David Stewart I've been talking about, probably showed 8 buckles. Later holders had 10, 12 and 8 buckles. There are no illustrations of the supporters in the coat of arms. That's normally 2 figures on either side. But from a description in the records, they were either 2 lions or a lady and a lion. And the crest at the top of the coat of arms appears to have been a hand holding a buckle. Most of the historical accounts refer to the castle as dating to the late 15th century. But there is an interesting account of a court case which suggests otherwise. This was heard in 1470, and it was alleged that Sir David Stewart had abducted a girl of 5, took her to his castle of Rosyth, and later married her against her will to his son Robert. As Sir David died in 1444, this suggests that the tower of the castle was built in the first half of the 15th century, and perhaps soon after the Crown Charter of 1428. This would make sense, as Sir David would no doubt have wanted to build a residence which would reflect his new status as a knight and holder of a barony. Sadly, we don't know the outcome of the court case, but if the claims were well founded, it doesn't portray Sir David in a very good light. To set against this rather unsavoury story from Sir David's past is a more praiseworthy one. Sir David Stewart was interested in literature, and it was at his instigation that Walter Bower, abbot of the monastery of Inchcolm, undertook the task of transcribing and continuing the Scotti-Chronicon, a history of Scotland begun by Sir John de Fordun, chaplain of the Church of Aberdeen. This is described by the National Library of Scotland as probably the most important medieval account of early Scottish history. This book cover is from a modern translation published by the Market Press. In the book, Walter Bauer acknowledges David Stewart's involvement thus: "I have agreed to satisfy the urgent requests of the noble knight Sir David Stewart of Rosyth, that is, to transcribe the following famous historical work by the venerable orator Sir John Fordun." When Sir David died in 1444, the barony passed down the Stewart line for a number of generations. The holders included Henry Stewart, who was taken prisoner after the rout of Solway Moss in 1542, and his son Robert, one of the signatories of the Act of Parliament of 1560, ratifying the Confession of Faith. Robert was buried in Dunfermline Abbey in 1577, contrary to the Act of the General Assembly against burials in churches. The minister, Mr. James McGill, was subsequently summoned before the Assembly to answer for this. His defence was that the provosts and bailies of Dunfermline had agreed to the burial, and he was not to blame. History repeated itself in 1660 on the death of James Stewart. This time the two abbey ministers attempted to prevent the burial inside the church, but several men acting on behalf of the Rosyth family forced an entry and the burial was carried out. So we have two Rosyth men lying in Dunfermline Abbey. William Stewart, who succeeded to the barony in 1683, had no children. Prior to his death, he sold the barony to David Drummond of Invermay in 1688, and thus ended the Stewart family association with Rosyth. In 1705, the barony was sold to the Earl of Rosebery, who in turn, in 1712, sold it to the Earl of Hopetoun. It remained in the Hopetoun family until 1903, when it was purchased by the Admiralty for the construction of the new naval base and dockyard. As you'll see from this old print, the castle had a value as a stronghold. It was largely surrounded by water and only approachable by a causeway on the north side, which was covered by water at certain high tides. In 1550, it was described in a document as a stronghold, tower and fortalice. This engraving was made at the end of the 18th century, but it is markedly different in some of the details from others around that time. For instance, it does not show the large window installed in the Great Hall in 1635. Was this artistic license, or was it perhaps a copy of an earlier engraving? For a building which has been around for so many years, we know relatively little of the history of the castle, apart from the succession of Stewarts who owned it. However, there are a few stories in the history book which might be of interest. The first is fiction, but it's worth hearing. Rosyth Castle is given a mention in Sir Walter Scott's novel The Abbot, published in 1820. According to the book, a party en route to Lochleven Castle to see the Queen, who was imprisoned there, were greeted with the discharge of a culverin, which is a medium to heavy cannon, from the battlements of the old castle of Rosyth, the lord of which had some quarrel with Lord Lindsay, one of the party. I imagine this firing of a cannon was the equivalent of shaking a fist at them. Connected with that story, although a legend rather than outright fiction, is the story that Mary Queen of Scots stayed the night at Rosyth Castle after her escape from Lochleven Castle in May 1568. I've always thought this seems very improbable, as you can imagine, that the Queen would want to get as far away as possible from Lochleven Castle and certainly across the Forth before resting. In April 1572, the castle was raided by soldiers who held Blackness Castle on the opposite shore. This is recorded in an old document and in modern-ish English reads, "Upon the 15th day of April, the soldiers of the Blackness crossed the water in a boat and spoilt the towns on the coast, and also the house of Rosyth, wherein they got great riches, and returned to Blackness without injury." Another legend relating to Rosyth Castle is that Oliver Cromwell's mother, being a daughter of the family of Stuart of Rosyth, was born in the castle, and that the Protector visited it during the time he commanded the army in Scotland. This is a drawing of Elizabeth Stuart, mother of Oliver Cromwell. These statements don't seem to have any foundation. In recent times, local historian George Robertson researched the matter and reached the same conclusion. Probably the most significant event in the castle's history arises from the Battle of Inverkeithing or Petrivy on the 20th of July 1651. This was between a royalist force and Oliver Cromwell's troops of the English Commonwealth. According to a 19th century historian, James Stewart, who succeeded to the barony in 1641, was loyal to Charles I and II, and the castle was possessed for the use of the king's forces before the battle. The two armies engaged near Inverkeithing, but when the royalist forces retreated, the fighting spread to the area of Petrivy Castle. This battle ended in a decisive victory for Oliver Cromwell's troops, although probably not so overwhelming a victory as some reports suggested. This print from a book, British Battles of Land and Sea, published in 1651, depicts Sir Hector Maclean and his clansmen staging a last stand said to be at Petrivy Castle. Sir Hector, 6 of his sons, and hundreds of the clan died in the battle. A memorial cairn was erected in 2001 to mark this event. For at least a week after the battle, Oliver Cromwell's forces remained encamped in the neighbourhood. The castle of Rosyth is reported to have been battered and was surrendered. It was occupied and plundered by the English army, along with the land round about. David Stewart was oppressed and harassed, and his estate sequestered, but according to the account, all these things never moved him. In 1698, part of the roof of the castle fell in while David Drummond of Invermay was still living in the castle. Not long after that, the buildings were allowed to stand tenantless and gradually lapsed into a ruinous condition. The famous landscape architect William Turner was in the Edinburgh area in 1818 and made numerous sketches of buildings on both sides of the Forth, including Rosyth Castle. The sketchbook is in the Tate Gallery, and you can see copies of the images online. The famous we don't think of Rosyth as a holiday location, but you will see from this advert in the Dunfermline Monthly Advertiser in 1837 that a cottage near the castle was being advertised as sea bathing quarters. In the story of Rosyth by Inverkeithing High School, it stated that a fishing station was established at Rosyth Castle in 1864, and the ground floor was used to house fishermen and their families. As you will see later, the ground floor is not very spacious. The British newspaper Digital Archive is increasingly providing us with information from local newspapers about events in the 19th century. We know that the Plymouth Brethren performed baptisms in the Forth near the castle in 1860. And this photo shows a visit by a rather distinguished group of men in about 1877. Other information gleaned from the archives is the Norwegian schooner Hilda, was driven onto the rocks near the castle in 1888, and that a young man drowned in 1898 while swimming in the waters near the castle. It was a popular spot for picnickers, particularly after they announced the building of the naval base in that area. And in the Dunfermline Journal of July 1903, it was reported that the site of the naval base continued to be visited by large crowds of people, and picnickers in the woods behind Rosyth Castle were more numerous than ever. Close by the castle was a foundry operated by John Angus and Brothers. The castle can be seen in the letter heading, and if this sketch is to be believed, it appears to have been a substantial enterprise. So let's have a look at the castle itself. So this drawing was published in 1887. The tower is constructed of massive masonry. Its external dimensions, for those that like to know these sort of things, are 48 feet 6 by 41 feet 3 by 57 feet 6 inches high to the top of the battlements. In metric measurements, that's 15 by 12.5 meters and 17 meters high. It's often the case with medieval castles that the tower is the oldest part of the castle, with an enclosure and outbuildings being added on in later and more peaceful times. In the case of Rosyth Castle, there are signs that an enclosure or barmkin wall was built at the same time as the castle. On the west and south sides of the tower, you can see where walls connected to the tower. And we're pointing this out with the white arrow marker. So it's not these diagonal roof lines that you see, which are the remains of a later building, but the rubble that goes almost to the top in that instance. The north range of the courtyard dates from the 16th century, and parts of it still remain. It comprised a vaulted ground floor and 2 upper floors, and was surmounted by a parapet walk. So I marked in this 1790 drawing the location of some gun loops and corbelled towers. At a low level on the front elevation are gun loops of the inverted keyhole type. These would probably have been used for lightweight handheld cannon, and this photograph is one of that is very intact, and you can see how he gets his name of an inverted keyhole. The remains of 2 turnpike stairs can be seen at first floor level, and this is one of them. Corbelled means that they are built out from the face of the wall, and that partly saves space, I think, and also gives good views around that side of the castle, those sides of the castle. Above the entrance porch are 2 inscribed stone tablets. Nothing can be made out of the bottom one. I would hazard a guess that this was perhaps the coat of arms of the Stuarts of Rosyth, which were removed when the castle was no longer in the ownership of the Stuarts. The top one, however, is very, very clear considering its age. It's the coat of arms of Mary, Queen of Scots. The sketch on the right gives a clearer view of the details. So there is the date 1561 at the top, which is when she came to the Scottish throne, and it is very likely that Mary did visit the castle at some time, but we've not been able to find anything in the records to confirm this. So we pass through this gateway, which would have opened into a trans, that's a passage passing under the northern range of the buildings. Most engravings show the front of the castle, and it's interesting to see this different view from 1789. It shows the ruins in a slightly more complete form, with some parts of the northern range of buildings connecting to the tower. Note also what appears to be an inscribed stone tablet, which we will come on to. The first floor of the Great Hall was created in 1635, with large windows being inserted. We can be reasonably sure of the date as there is an inscription on the transom of one of the windows which says JS MN Anno 1635. So that's the initials for James Stewart and Margaret Napier and the year 1635. I can just imagine Margaret coming to the castle for the first time and wanting improvements made to the Great Hall to make it more bright and comfortable if she was going to be living there. The work carried out could perhaps be likened to a modern day makeover. I don't know if the name Napier rang any bells for you, or if it has any significance for you, but if you were at school in the 50s and 60s, as I was, it might. If not, here is a clue. So this is a book of logarithm tables, and Margaret Napier was the eldest daughter of James Napier of Merchiston, who was the inventor of logarithms. So earlier on I mentioned an inscribed stone, and it's referred to in a number of accounts of the castle. In one of them it is reported that the old stone was removed in 1842. And this photo shows a man pointing to where the stone was once located, beside the entrance door into the tower. We tried to recreate this stone for an event we held at the castle in 2008. We took a photo of one of the castle stones to try to get a good colour and texture match, but regrettably it came out with a green tinge. So in more modern times, this reads, "In due time, draw this cord, the bell to clink, whose merry voice warns to meat and drink." Warn is probably used in the sense of giving advance notice of, i.e. the ringer of the bell can look forward to being supplied with meat and drink. Before we step inside the castle, a brief word about the other outbuildings. The photo on the left is the south range, of which only the foundations are left. In one historical account, the author said that there appeared to be the remains of a 4-gun battery to the seaward area of the south range. But that's the only mention that I've seen of this gun battery. The photo on the right is of the western and northern ranges, which are more complete. There is little evidence of as to what these buildings were used for. One suggestion is that there was a chapel on the ground floor, and another that there was a hall on the first floor, which may have taken the place of the Great Hall that we saw, or we're about to see in the tower. So we're now going to go inside the castle. It originally extended to 3 main floors and an attic. On entering, you pass through a small lobby. So this photo looks back through the lobby to the outside. So as we look at this photo, there's a sort of recess on the right-hand side, which I think was for hanging cloaks and what have you. And on the left-hand side, that is the stairway up to is the entrance to the turnpike stair, which ran the whole height of the tower and provided access to all the floors. So the ground floor was divided into 2 levels by a wooden floor, and from the upper part there was a servant's stairway up to the Great Hall. So the arrow again is showing you where that was. The walls in the ground floor are massively thick, about 10 feet 6, and you can get a feel for that by just looking at that window there. The walls are not so thick in the first floor, and you'll see that although it's on the same basic footprint, it's a much more spacious room. We are going to go up to the Great Hall by the main stairway, at least we would if we could. So this turnpike stair ran the full height of the tower in its day. This is a rather sorry picture, but all this debris on the bottom of the turnpike stair is actually pigeon droppings and feathers and so on, because from time to time the pigeons manage to get up to the top of the turnpike stair, what's left of it, and they roost there, and the droppings and so on fall down. It is netted over at times, but they seem to manage to get underneath it. So when we open it up for events, this all has to be cleared out to make it usable. So to get up to from the turnpike stair, what's left of it, up to the Great Hall, we go up a wooden ladder, and we don't have a photograph of that, but although it's quite steep, it's been fitted with sides and some scaffolding handrails, which make it usable by most people. So this is when we first started to have dealings with the castle. This was simply an empty shell. There were no furniture or furnishings of any kind. This has now been furnished after a fashion for the event that we held here in 2008. So this large table in the middle was actually built in situ, using roof beams and so on. The banners that you see on the wall were made by one of our members, who was a seamstress, and we brought in other things to try and make it look a bit more like the castle would have done in its time. And this is another view. This is looking out the large window that we saw earlier on from the outside. So it was quite impressive, I think, and we had a lot of people in that week, including some hundreds of school children who were bussed down to experience what life in a castle might have been like. And there was a falconry display, and we had a storyteller telling them stories in the lower part. And they had the opportunity to dress up after a fashion and do some medieval dances and so on. So a good week. So above this, you'll see there's again a barrel vaulted roof, and above this there are two more floors. Access to these two floors is by a very steep wooden ladder, which you can just see on the left-hand side. So steep that I've never had the courage to go up it, although Sandy Masterton has. It's got no handrails or anything, but you can see the two floors that would have been accessed by the turnpike stair. Sorry, so this is two photographs of these two floors. There's no roof between the second floor and the attic, so the markers there give you an idea of where that roof level would have been. Quite small rooms by comparison to the Great Hall downstairs, but you'll see the reason for this when we have a look at the next photo, which is an aerial photograph. So can we point to that, where the attic room is, Sandy? Thank you. So there's the attic room there, and so round about it there had to be provision for this walkway right round the battlements, and that's reduced the size of the upper rooms. And a question you might have been thinking about but been too polite to ask is, where are the toilets? Something that children are always very good at asking. Now, they were actually accessed off that turnpike stair that we were looking at, and the waste was conveyed down through the thickness of this wall on the east side by sort of chutes, and the arrow is pointing to some gaps at the bottom of the wall, so the waste and not only toilet waste but kitchen waste would come down and these chutes and lie at the bottom. And I think the theory was that when the tides come in, the water washed all the waste out. Whether the tides came in sufficiently high and sufficiently often to do that, I don't know, but it sounds quite a good theory, although these days not considered very eco-friendly. So I've spoken about the castle's past, but what of its future? It is difficult to know what to do with shells, buildings like this. There was a feasibility study carried out some years ago looking at the possibility of renovating it in some way and adapting it for use as a restaurant, but this was not taken any further. And as far as I know, there are no plans for its future other than to continue to preserve and maintain it. It is very much landlocked. You'll see this high security fence round about. That wasn't intended to protect the castle. It was really to mark the boundary of the Forth Ports Authority, who own land. You see where the man in the orange jacket is walking off, that's all Forth Ports land. On the very right-hand edge of the picture is the gatehouse into Forth Ports. So it's very much landlocked. You can just get access via the pavement where you see that 20 mph sign, and there's a gate there that lets you get into the castle ground. So it would be difficult in the current situation to do much with it, but that remains to be seen. The castle stood there all this time, and I'm sure it will stand for another 100 years until something else happens to it. So before finishing, we're going to take a little walk just about 300 yards north of this, because in the Orchard Head Woods we have this Castle Doocot, which is in a good state of preservation, subject to a comment I'm going to make later on. So in 1503, King James IV directed all lords and ladies, all lords and lairds, to build deer parks, stanks, that's for fish, caningaries for rabbits, and pigeon houses. Pigeon houses are known in England as dovecots, but in Scotland are more commonly called Doocots. They were a useful supply of meat at times of years when much else would have been dried, smoked, salted and pickled, and they also provided pigeon eggs. Rosyth Doocot was probably built in the 16th century and was certainly in existence in 1576, as it is referred to in a charter of that year. The doorway is round the far side of the Doocot. We can't see that yet. So the dimensions is it's 20 feet high, or 20 feet, sorry, it's 20 feet or 6 meters square, with crow-step gables and a barrel vaulted roof covered with flagstones. Above the entrance door is this carving, which has been partly defaced, but is thought to be a serpent. Top left is a photograph taken in 2013, and on the right is a sketch of what the complete carving might have looked like. There are almost 1,000 pigeonholes in the Doocot. What a noise and smell there must have been inside there. Unfortunately, the Doocot has been subject to vandalism in recent years, with the stone being chipped away at the hinges at the entrance gates in an attempt to get in. It has also been spray painted, but it's still very much in good repair internally, and it's been much admired by people who have come to see it during the doors open days. So that's rather a sad note on which to end this talk, but I hope you have found it of interest, and we may do something else again at some other time. Thank you.